We're live, Apurva.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joel. Parismita, I'm going to start the talk then.
Right. Yes.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so hello and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for the sixth and the penultimate C Conversations of this semester's series. It's called Drawing Worlds. And as the title suggests, the series looks at drawing as a practice that is rooted in ways of seeing and one that also produces ways of seeing and engaging with the environment and the world. And C Conversations is done under the umbrella of C City, which is the school's cultural outreach program. And C City, for many, many years, since the beginning of the school 10 years ago, has been organizing lectures, events, exhibitions to which the wider public is invited to engage. And our conversations typically see participants join us from many, many places. And C Conversations is also supported by the Urban Center Mumbai. So there's that. And we have joining us today Parismita Singh, which is a big deal for us. And Parismita Singh, just to sketch out her, her bio for you, she's a writer, artist, and educator based in Assam. And she has published the graphic novels The Hotel at the End of the World and Mara and the Clay Cows, and a collection of short stories, Pieces Come. She helped conceptualize the Pao Anthology of Comics, and she has also edited Centrepiece, New Writing and Art from Northeast India. She's also the author of an illustrated column for the online magazine Voice of Fashion and the NRC Sketchbook, a graphic reportage series for Huffington Post India. And she also works on a grassroots community education project with Pratham Education Foundation. Parismita, thank you so much for joining us here today. And so I'll fade into the background, and we'll have you present your talk, and then at the end of it, we typically have our participants post some questions. If they'd like to join us at the end of the talk and ask you the questions themselves, then we allow for that as well. And we'll collect the questions from YouTube and Zoom, wherever they come in, and it'll just follow a discussion that we could have maybe on the work. So with that, I'll just ask Parismita to present her work. Thank you.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much, Apurva, and the team at SEA for organizing this really delightful array of conversations around drawing. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to talk about my work. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me here. And thank you for tuning in to listen. Right. So just to begin, I've titled my talk, The Wayward Line and Other Adventures in Image Making. In a way to hint at or follow a narrative line through my process, because I work with both images and text. And so I've written fiction, and I've also written graphic novels. I do a lot of drawing as a part of my art practice. And through my journey, because now it's been, for instance, Hotel at the End of the World, which is a graphic novel that I'll just touch upon a little later. That's already, I mean, it's already been like more than a decade since it was published. So if I were to trace a trajectory or follow a line that my various works and engagements have followed in all these years, then I would say it is in some sense a wayward line, because it does not, because it's just traveling all over the place and having all these experimenting with all these different forms and asking all these different questions, both at the level of form as well as content. What I'm going to do is, I think just to give you a sense of where I come from, I'm just going to briefly take you through some of my published work, which is the books, right? Just for you to have a sense of, to be able to frame the narrative around the kind of work I do, right? So, yes. So the whole question of writing and drawing, right, is a very interesting one, and it's something that poets and comic book artists and writers have engaged with for a very long time. So the poet Ted Hughes, for instance, he would refer to his writing, his poetry, as a form of drawing. while Art Spiegelman, the comic book artist who produced the Mouse, he often identifies as a writer who also draws his stories in that sense. So I think this necessity, not so much the ability, but this necessity to move across forms and mediums, while we continue to engage with the line, the line that produces the writing, because I still for a lot of my stories, I still work in long form, in longhand, so the writing or in the book, so the writing in your in paper, the drawing. I think there are. It does come together in some sense as following this wayward line. So here I've just put in a couple of. So Peace Has Come is a book of short stories, and Centrepiece was a book that I sort of. It's an edited book. It's a book I helped put together, but it's something that I still hold very dear, because this is another space where I was able to bring together my interest in and writing as well as art, as well as being able to work with a collective of other artists and writers and photographers and people who work with images and a story, and sometimes a non-story too. Um, and as artists and as writers, we have they're very rare occasions where we're able to sort of work as a collective, because so much of drawing and so much of doing a book is done in solitude in some sense. It is just you and the laptop, or you and the piece of paper. So yes, so Centrepiece. So Centrepiece is something that I hold very dear, because it was a chance to sort of engage at the level with the community as well. And then, of course, there is Hotel at the End of the World and Marana Clay Cows, both graphic novels. And I have continued to work with the graphic novel medium across the years. And, I have works online that you can check up later, or we can look, in the question and answer thing, I can go back to them in more detail. But today, for the purpose of the talk, and for the purpose of the wayward line, what I thought I would focus on two things. One is how I use drawing and the sketchbook, right? The wayward line of the sketchbook, the line that is not so much compelled by a narrative or a desire to go somewhere specific. So the wayward line of the a notebook of the sketchbook, and how how I've been able to use that in my fiction, and also how the sketch, how my process for using it in nonfiction. Because I find it very interesting that they're very different, that both forms, working in fiction and working in nonfiction, have both been, in fact, they've had similarities, but they've also been very different. And at each stage, I've had to question my own process, like the wayward line, go forward and backward, and in a sense rethink my process at every juncture. So yes, I would, since we're talking about drawing and the wayward line, I would really like to, from here, I would like to look at the drawing in the sketchbook and see how that translates into different parts. Because many of you are students, and it's a great time to have your notebooks, and it doesn't matter, it can be digital. I mean, I think I don't see that much of a distinction between sort of having an iPad or a digital form of sketching, or a paper or notebooks. And I think and I can imagine that as architecture students or students of art, you're probably doing a lot of that, like doing a lot of these sketches. So I think so yes, I'm going to share a little bit of how that has worked for me in my work. Yes, so this is so this is just to take you through the each of my publications that I've already spoken about. Yeah. So when it came to my first book, which was the graphic novel Hotel at the End of the World, I didn't have the luxury of, say, a research grant, or being able to say that, okay, now I have my story, now let me go out into the places where my story is based and do these sketches and come back. So it was quite interesting. I did do some of that. I did do the research after I did my story, but I find it. But sometimes I think that with Hotel at the End of the World, sometimes. So here you see here on the screen, what you see is a page from the book, and then and I also have a photograph of a. I don't have the sketch any longer. You know, when you're younger, I didn't care much for archiving or keeping all my notebooks in place. I don't have the sketchbook any longer, but I'd come across. But when I was traveling, I'd come across this tank on in the middle of Kohima town. It's still there, I think. And I'd done all these sketches because I had a Sunday. You know, nothing happens in Kohima. Like nothing much happens on a Sunday. So I spent the whole day just sketching this tank. And later, when the story happened, right when I was doing the whole book, this tank sort of becomes it features in one of the stories as a form of um, I mean, as it moves the story forward in some ways. The tank, it is almost a character, very small character, but it's there. And I like to think that it was not so much that it was more, that it is possible that it was the sketches of the tank that inspired the story, or that, you know, and I mean, that's something I like to muse over. Was it the sketch of the tank that inspired the story, or was it that I was at this point of the story and I was able to look back at the sketch and make it a part of it? But it also goes to show that, like, so, but with my fiction work, a lot of the time, like illustrations that I've done, that sketches that I've done without a very specific purpose, just for an exercise of the hand, I find interest, or I find something interesting, often comes and plays a role in my stories, sometimes in a few months' time, sometimes immediately, and sometimes years later. So yes, and this whole question of sketchbooks was, and it's something that, in fact, I think at some point I would love to. I'm grateful for this talk because I started thinking about this whole question of sketchbooks again, and I think at some point I would probably like it'd be nice. I would like to work on this and do something around the idea of the sketchbook, because I was thrilled. You know, I was um, at UPenn last year, and I was thrilled to be able to have come across a really tiny artist sketchbook that had been retrieved somewhere in North India. And, you know, and historians are amazing. They're able to date all of this. So here was this little um, sketchbook, an artist sketchbook with text in Sanskrit, which I can't, I mean, which I don't read. But what you had were, but we knew nothing about whose sketchbook it was. You know, it was just one of those things that came up that just got preserved. And we have no idea whose sketchbook it was, but what we have are all these sketches. And sometimes that makes me think that, you know, if all that remained of my work was one sketchbook, what would it say about my work? Because this sketchbook was fascinating, because I felt like I felt like I could imagine the whole world around this, because, you know, there are mistakes, there is white now, there are different hands, and so yes, and and this is another uh, page from a sketchbook that I did. You know, these are sketches that I did because there was a long afternoon in Norbalinka in Himachal Pradesh, and it was muggy, and, you know, it was and I had nothing much to do. I didn't have a plan, so I spent a lot of time making these sketches of, and these are very rough sketches. You know, there's nothing. I mean, stylistically, I don't find anything very interesting in these works, but it was a way of working the hand. It was also a way of establishing a relationship with all these women who were weaving and, you know, doing all these work in the workshops in Norbalinka. And what is interesting is that I eventually used this illustration, used the sketch as a part of a scroll. And this is a scroll that I worked in into 2020, when we all got shut down with the pandemic. So one of the projects I did, one of my pandemic projects, was a scroll where where I used all my sketches from my travel diaries, you know, from all, you know, so it was a little bit like traveling through my sketchbooks. I got all these sketchbooks out, And along with my sketchbooks also, in case, if you notice, there are also these strange creatures that you see all around, like these little monsters. So I used my sketchbooks and I used my son's drawings, which he was doing by like the hundreds, because it was a pandemic and children didn't have anything to do and didn't have schools to go to. So I basically used my son's drawings. I traced them out on the scroll, and my sketchbook images of travel. And I think, and I think in a way it sort of became a metaphor of my time then, of being trapped in some sense, of all of us being caught up, trapped, confined very much, and then having to travel in our mind, having to travel with whatever resources we had, whatever memories we had, whatever tokens we had. And so yes, so and now that I'm sort of talking about it, and I had to think about the wayward line, I think this is an example of the magic of those wayward lines, that what a drawing can do for you. Because I think in some sense doing this through the pandemic probably helped me travel in some sense back to all the places that I would never go back to, in a sense. Right. And so, yes. So after this, I just want to take a moment and step away from the world of fiction to the to adventures that this wayward line has had when it has when have decided to take it into nonfiction. And because I think I worked with nonfiction, I think very late in my career. I was really surprised. I did my first serious nonfiction works in 2018, like really serious commission work. You do these little stories, you do vignettes, you do that kind, but I've never had like commission nonfiction work, which had to work roughly within some journalistic standards, and war reporting, and work that was reporting actively on events in the ground, political events. So that kind of nonfiction work I'd actually not done till 2018, and by then I already had a fairly sizable body of work as far as fiction. I'd also written I'd written the graphic novel, and I'd written the fiction pieces come, and all of which draws from political events, but are not necessarily nonfiction. They had the license to invent and escape and do all the things that fiction allows you to do. But and so here, which is why I say that I'd really like you to take a moment now and then sort of recalibrate and think of like, okay, what is it? Is the of the similarities, differences? Because again, I'm sure, like when you do your classes and you're talking to professors at this stage, you're debating a lot on, like, the messy lines, the blurry lines between fiction and non-fiction, right? I mean, and what how these are categories that cannot be contained in these very they're not sealed containers or categories in that sense. But which is why, I mean, and these are questions we can answer later, which is that I ask you to sort of take a moment while I sort of move to the wayward lines journey into nonfiction work, right? So the nonfiction work, and I sort of I put that in my bio because this is work that I don't know if I'm ever going to publish in a paper form, or it's sort of it doesn't even show up that much on Google search, because the website was taken down and then they put it in archive somewhere. But this is work that was very important to me as an artist, as a writer, as probably a human being too, as if you can call these different categories, if you see them all as like different parts of yourself or different beings of yourself in that sense. But yes, so so basically I did this series of graphic novel, graphic reportage works, 2000 from 2018 to 2020. I worked with an editor. I had deadlines. I had, like, we had very interesting conversations about, like, journalistic, about how I was told that, about following certain journalistic norms, like real names and things like that. And this was during when this was during the NRC, when Assam 2018, 2020, they went through 2018, 19. They went through this exercise of producing citizenship tests through the NRC as a way of figuring out who is a citizen and who isn't. It was a very complex bureaucratic exercise. And but I mean, I'm not going to go into details of that because we don't have the time. I'll focus on the writing and the drawing and the questions that arise out of it. So yes, I did a series of these graphic reportage or visual essays, which had both text as well as images to report on what was happening in the ground of in those days. Right. So there is so much that is happening all over the world with graphic reportage, with graphic ethnography. The anthropologists have been doing a lot of work with graphics as well, and also this whole question of slow journalism, where you're really taking where you're trying to where you're resisting in some sense this very headline and this very like event of the moment pressure. And so here is so this is an image I have from one of my essays, from one of the graphic reportage. So what you have here is you have the image of a boat, and the background it's superimposed on it's drawn on a newspaper, Assamese newspaper. And so here what nonfiction allowed me to do is record both the moment in both image as well as text, right? So this is really about, this is about conversation I was having. This is about a remark that a neighbor made about the NRC process, and how she felt that despite having gone through this entire NRC process, people that she thought was suspicious or not Indian enough continued to remain. Like, the prejudice did not go despite having done this extremely elaborate exercise, right? Because to her, anyone who looked in a certain way, people who looked in a certain way in a boat together, traveling across the thing, was a marker of the foreigner, right? And so I was able to use, in a sense, the image, and also here what graphic reportage allowed me to do, in a sense, was also contrast what would be a very otherwise romantic image, of this property, like a diesel engine boat in the river with the background, while at the same time the text could underline this really, really wretched and very hateful environment that we were in at that moment, right? So here, so I use as an entry point. Here suddenly, once I was in the field, right, because this again, a lot of this work was based on interviews and being on the field, right? So interviews, reporting, talking to people, talking to government officials, putting it all together like any kind of report, like any kind of report, except with images. And suddenly I saw, and suddenly I felt, with this project, I felt the weight of responsibility, because suddenly drawing became witness. And again, I go back to the wayward line, because we have to question that. If drawing becomes witness, then, then what are the implications of that? What kind of responsibility does what kind of responsibility does the wayward line take upon itself when drawing becomes a form of witness, when drawing becomes a form of news? And also, so question that will come, yes. So the other thing is, of course, as practitioners, as most of you are, as students working with architecture or art or journalism or different fields, there is, I should not, when I talk about the sense of responsibility or bearing witness, I have to also remind you, or I have to also remind myself, or I have to also put it back on track, that this was extremely, it was also very, very interesting project from me. It was very exciting. And it was exciting because of the sheer challenge of it. One is the other thing that I have, the other thing that one has to remember is that when I was working on the NRC series, I'm based in Assam, when I was working on NRC series, this was for a national website, and the biggest challenge I had was, one is that there's a certain amount of news wariness by then, because people are also already hearing about the NRC, getting all this news. And two was, people aren't really that interested in some citizenship test happening, and that is affecting people in some village in a part of Assam, right? So the challenge here was that through visuals, I had to make the stories of interest. It was also, the challenge was also to grab people's attention and ensure that they're able to, and ensure that they stay on the subject, that they read through it, and that form of engagement happens. And I think images really helped in that. The sense of place that images can convey, right? Of course, you can do that with words as well. But it is the comics, but working with comics and working with the visual essay, I think it really helped me achieve that with readers, in a sense. Just give people a sense of place and locate the stories. Yes. Um, um, Yeah. So, I don't want to get into what the citizenship test entailed, and except that it was a very difficult time for any kind of citizenship tests or any kind of requirement that you have to submit documents to prove your citizenship. It is always something that's very that particularly affects women, because women, as we know, often in rural areas and non-privileged area, from non-privileged families, in very patriarchal setups, often do not have documentation for a variety of reasons. They don't own land, they don't own property, they don't go to school, so they don't have all this registered. If they're born in the village, often their birth's not registered. So all of that. So this was so that's the other. I think these visual essays also allowed me a chance to work because of and this also goes to the strength of the visual medium. Because I was working with a new medium, I had a chance to be able to explore stories that may not have otherwise interested people, say a lot of women's perspectives. So I was able to really work with a lot of women's perspectives on the NRC of different, and I was able to work with uh, and yeah, so yes, and right, and also different and women who are often marginalized, or in some sense, or whose voices we don't necessarily take into um, account. And at the question at the and that's what I started, and that's where I also decided, like, so why am I sketching this? What does the sketch help me do? So in some sense, at its very simplest, at its most basic, you're able to highlight the voice of someone, a voice that you feel ought to be heard. And yeah. So, because going back to the question of form, right? So why, and the other question that will come, that comes up very natural when you're looking at this is, of course, what is the difference between a photograph and a sketch, right? So why bother with graphic reportage, which works with sketches, when you can very well just, when the conventional mode is to just, is to use photographs and have a story. And this was really a question that was very central to my work with the NRC sketches, with the interviews I did, or with even other projects, other graphic narrative projects that I did around that time on Assam, which is that one of the things that I felt very uncomfortable about while looking at a lot of articles which had photographs of people who had often lost citizenship, or were fighting for citizenship, or had some kind of problem, was I thought that a question that was right out there but was not being addressed enough was that of privilege, right? And care for your subject. Because one of the so one of the it's a really, really difficult situation to be in, to be in a situation where you may lose your citizenship either through a court case or you're not able to submit your documents. It puts you in a very vulnerable position, because if you're a non-citizen, you essentially have no rights. So, and you can be taken away to a detention center. There are all of these things that, in the background. So one of the questions is that so when you go into these villages, as journalists, so people who write for the English media, when we go into these villages and we do these interviews and we take these photographs, one is how much information are we giving? What is the nature of the consent when these photographs are being taken? How much information are we giving them about not just the photo being taken for the article, but also about the whole politics of circulation of images? That a photo that you take and you say that, oh, this is for your report, it may actually be in circulation in the web forever. So even if 5 years later you decide, oh, I don't want this photograph of mine in this article, you don't have a choice. So all of these questions I was in the field doing this reportage, seeing other things being published, and these were very and these were questions that I was really grappling with. And I felt somewhere that a sketch, which is not an exact representation of the person, right, which does not where I mean I think there it is using a sketch in such a situation is often, I felt, a more sensitive way of portraying a person in such a crisis, right? And of course, I mean, and this is debatable. This is something that I think we should question and discuss more. But I really felt that the primacy of a sketch and over a photograph in a situation, in very precarious situation, I think there was something there. Yes. Yes, so I just want to go quickly because I just wanted to come to this because it has a closer connection to what we just spoke about. And yes, so and then later when I did I read up more, I realized that these questions of representation, the questions of consent in photographs, of consent in interviews, these are questions that people are grappling with in different disciplines, so it is a part. So there's a lot of ethnographic graphic narratives being done now which are questioning a lot of this. And there is so it's not like, so which is also the whole multidisciplinary angle of the work we do, that often questions we have as an artist or as a writer, these are questions sometimes asked by anthropologists, these are questions asked by the journalists. And I think this sharing, what we are doing today, you as architecture students are being kind enough to listen to me. So I think this exchange, this engagement across disciplines is very necessary, because sometimes if you feel that other people are asking the same questions, and in these conversations we may not find an exact answer, but I think it's very possible to begin a conversation and understand these problems better. So, because my classic example is always this, right? So what happened? So what happened would be, there would be very, very chaotic instances in all this NRC journey when people are making journeys to go and submit citizenship documents. And then they have accidents on the road. And then, it's really and then they're stuck in, and then and these are very poor people traveling long distances, and then they get stuck in hospitals. And then they're still worried about missing that hearing, missing that date for when they have to submit their documents. And a lot of these, and so what happened is a lot of these photographs were being, were being being taken, because activists who were in those hospitals were so helpless and shocked, and they said the world ought to know this is happening, right? So they don't tell us not to send these disturbing photographs, because you ought to know what is happening. So there was this point of view. The other point of view was, is that woman in such that, does that woman who is in such a vulnerable position, crying and injured in the hospital, and often because of questions of, being a woman or your religious identity and so on, sometimes, would they have been comfortable being photographed at that moment? Even though for the larger question, it is important that this story gets out, that there is suffering. So, there are no easy answers to all of this, but I found that, so I did reproduce that image, right? And I felt that by reproducing that image, I was able to give, I was able to preserve her, protect her identity. I was able to use some ethic of care, right? So none of these, I think, none of these are easy solutions. And of course, I feel like I think I have more questions than I have answers, but which is also what compels us to keep working. And yes, so and in so this is what so this is also where the wayward line brings you, that there was fiction, but with the nonfiction work, there was really a much the weight of responsibility, the stakes of a drawing somehow just got much somehow just got much the weight of it was much more. It became it became it became it almost opened up questions that perhaps I did not have when I was doing sketches and using nonfiction. And what is interesting is that after my nonfiction work, I also began to question the process that I use for my fiction. So I was also, this experience also in a sense really opened me up to question a lot of my past work, a lot of my past processes, past methods. And then, and it's true, said, I do realize that some of the things, some methods that I used, perhaps 10, 15 years ago, I may think twice about or do it differently now, which is also the journey of all of us working together and sharing work. And um, because sharing any kind of work, putting out a book, is also making yourself vulnerable to these questions, to these criticisms. But I think it is but it's a part of the process, and I think continuing to question, continuing to think and doubt. These are as important as training your hand to be able to work well, or train, working with, or working and reworking a text to achieve stylistic ends, for stylistic ends. So I think both of it are equally important as a part of the process. So Purva, have I been speaking for very long? What is the time like?
No, I think we could hear you for even longer. It's
Yeah.
6:40, but you can take your time to conclude it.
Okay. Yeah. So yes. So it's a bit of a yes. And I don't, and so that's the other thing. I also want us to see, I also want us to not forget that drawing is also fun. It's also telling a story. And I had a lot of some of the stories that I was telling was really terrible, and it was, and some of it was also an eye opener to me about different things happening in the country, and especially in the rural areas. And but it was also very, very exciting, right? Because to be able to be in the to be able to for instance, one of the pieces that I worked in was uh, just to see how how people in rural India, or especially with areas which would have otherwise, say, a decade or so ago, as soon as close as that, would have had would have really been suffering under insurgency, or would have had insurgent movements which are really fighting the state in that sense. And then to see, but and then so and then to see their transition into nationalism, into Indian nationalism, with the passage of time, and especially this 2019, and I think this was a very cheeky piece in some sense, because I'm looking at how information works in type of crisis, and I'm looking at like WhatsApp videos and TVs and phones, mostly smartphones, and all of them, and all of it is done in like pen and ink drawing. Right, pen and ink scan drawings with like yeah. So I enjoyed that a little bit. So I enjoyed that play in some sense, right? So I think because I think it's also important to not get bogged down. I sometimes do that, to not get bogged down by your subject, and to also have a sense, to also be able to, at least at the level of style, at the level of form, we have that. At least we have that, variable. There is a certain amount of play you can do at that level, while even within nonfiction, right? And okay, so the other thing I also want to highlight is the other great, I think everyone should do, I'm sure you're doing all these architecture assignments and, journalism assignments as students. And, as you get, as an independent artist, I stopped working to deadlines after a point, in the sense of not tight deadlines, and this, I always made sure I had a little bit of time for thought and to, for text and to be able to, and suddenly non-fiction reportage with which worked with the news cycles was crazy, because you had to, like, if the if a certain NRC list was coming out on the 30th, you had to get the piece out. You had to send in the piece on the 30th, even though you're sitting and doing interviews on 29th. And images take time, right? Images take time. So for me, there was also a lot of that, having to work with. Having to work on that line, having to also having to also okay images at the sketch level, right? So those of you who work with sketches, you'll know, right? You do many frames, you do many roughs, many things before you actually work on the final page. But with this, but working with news, working with deadlines, I had to also let go of that. A lot of it was just very rough work, but for the in order to be able to tell the larger story within this time frame. Yes. Yeah. So, and it was not all, and some of it was also, and some of it, and I learned a lot of that, which is the other thing. Um, um, a lot of, I don't have those images today because I think I didn't want to sort of scatter the talk around a lot of scatter the talk around too many projects, and that gets confusing. But so one of the things that I've really enjoyed is, and which is the point I make about how drawings are also shaped by how the wayward line is also shaped by political events, by history, by exigencies. That unlike most of you students, I did not have the good fortune of going to art school. Right. So I have never had the luxury of someone actually telling me, go out there and do a sketchbook full of images, or, here's an assignment, go to the market, do all of this. So it was just things that I did on my own. And I really, really developed a love of sketching because in one particular work assignment, I worked for many years. I still continue to do so in Western Assam. And when I was working that time, it was very, very politically volatile. So you set out for work in the morning to a village, and and before you reach the auto stand, you find out that a bandh has been called. So your entire day's work, whatever you had planned, like nothing happens. You just go back home. So what I would do then was go to whatever the nearby chai shop, and all the chai shops in Western Assam, in 8 places I was working with, were run by women. Women were hanging around there, and the markets all had women. So then I would either go to the market or go to the chai shop and sit there and drink tea and sketch. Right. And so when I did the nonfiction work in 2018, I had that practice to back me up. Yeah, which is also an important thing, like whether you're doing fiction or nonfiction, because the other thing to also bring out, I think, as a form of conclusion is also that at the end of the day, you sometimes it may be a non-fiction project you're doing, it may be a fiction project you're doing, but often it comes back down to those days and days of practice of doing sketches when you didn't really have a project in mind, or but all the learnings you had of establishing relations with the people you're sketching, figuring out this two-way communication. It's a very classic thing, because I always, this whole question of consent, I make sure the person who I'm sketching knows I'm sketching her, right? So it's done through a lot of these, like a smile, showing the pen, and then and also at the same time entreating with your eyes that please don't move, and then it becomes a collective community thing. Yeah. So the other thing, so I think to conclude, that is equally important, the joy of just doing the work we do. So everything else, I think, builds up on that. That at the most basic level, what sketching does for me is it gives me joy. It gives me a sense of connection. Sometimes it's a form of meditation, sometimes it's a form of communication, of being in the world, and whatever else you build on top of it at the at the most basic, it is what it is. Sketching with moving around with a notebook in my hand is also a thing utter joy for me. Right. So I think, yes. And with that, I can just connect it up to workshops. Yeah. So I do a lot of workshops, which is another space where I feel that a lot of these questions can be asked, where you're able to stand, sit back and look at your process and find a lot of these questions and all these and also have and also, when you do workshops with a range of people, with people from different backgrounds and weavers and activists and children, I feel, again, to reiterate that whole joy of creating, which is the basis of everything we do. This is this is, I think, another way of connecting and creating that. Brings us back to the most basic function of the line, that we write with, that we grow with, and that we connect to other people with, right? So I think, yes. So I think with that, because I really would like some space for conversation. So I think with that, we can conclude. Yes, Apurva, should decent time? Yeah,
Yes.
time is okay. Yeah.
Yeah, we're good for time. Thank you. Okay, Parismita, that was wonderful, and thank you so much for speaking of the drawing and, the narrative so generously. And I wanted to discuss it a little bit in terms of, the graphic novel that emerges, because it is a form that, we often borrow in the drawings of what we make from the field. And it becomes a way of, like, bringing reportage back into the construction of an argument. And of course, it comes with its own history and a whole set of assumptions around its nature and capabilities that have not been, fully dislodged, because the graphic novel or the comic book, because they often refer to as comic books,
Yes.
also they've in so many ways been associated with, like, subversive storytelling. And of course, you have many kinds and versions of visual storytelling from everywhere, of course, but the graphic novel itself, and that specific form has a specific history, and it is historically made space for voices, because it is also proliferated in these throwaway forms of zines and cheap books and things that
Yes.
are quick circulating. And you've often spoken about the politics of form as well. And there's this part in the introduction to Joe Sacco's book on Palestine, where Edward Said, he describes the medium as liberating and as subversive, and he's talking about his own interaction with comics and graphic novels. And he says that, in the making of the comic and the graphic novel itself, they have into their logic, the ideas of bodies and behaviors that sort of go against this unruffled storytelling that is expected to be a part of how you learn, how you interpret the world. And they're definitely not ways in which you engage with the question of history or you read anything like history. Um, and you very often find the form of telling, because, as something that is neither writing nor drawing or even, it's some, it relies on the form of the graphic narrative. And this becomes, very relevant, because a lot of graphic reportage is centering on difficult subjects like, displacement and disaster and oppression. And this field is a very difficult field. And I just wanted to, if you could just talk a little bit more about, like, what are the urgent questions that inform your ways of engaging with the field. And
Yeah.
you have the quick sketches, you have the drawing on site, you have drawings while speaking, you have drawings as translations from interviews. If you could just speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, thank you, Apurva. That's an excellent question. So first of all, every time, Joe Sacco is really like the person you mention when you think of graphic reportage, because he has done such fantastic work with the books, right? Now, this is where, Apurva, the other question that comes in is that, graphic reportage, as opposed to Hotel at the End of the World, right? As opposed to a book of fiction. What happens is, I think, and I may be wrong, and and I hope to be challenged on this, in a sense, right? I think thing that we have to also take into account is, just um, these graphic nonfiction pieces need a lot of resources, right? They need a lot of resources. So with fiction, you can do so with fiction. You tell some stories. You decide that, oh, you want to tell some stories, and you take 4 years, 5 years, and you do it in your time. All of that. That's great. But but because I don't know, I haven't looked at Joe Sacco's process well, and I mean closely enough. But I know that but one is that you cannot begin with doing an entire Palestine, right? It has to begin with short stories or Zines or whatever. Now a story of, say, Sacco's caliber, or even in this very, very much lower scale, in this much more rough and tumble way, the kind of work I did for the NRC thing. One is that you need a very good editor.
Need a very
And
good, sorry?
you need a good editor.
Right.
Right, because these pieces, I feel like, because that's something else we should talk about, that there is a whole ecosystem. So when you see something like Palestine, and I may be wrong, and I'll be happy to be wrong, but you see a book like that, when you see all of these books, there is a whole ecosystem around this, right? So what I mean is that, so you'll need an editor who understands the graphic novel more and is willing to put their pesa on this, right? And is willing to say, okay, Apurva, go out into Mumbai and get me a story on the situation of power and what and how the rains are affecting the lower income areas of the city, right? So then it's really like you get commission commission shorter pieces by an editor who will be able to direct you in some ways through journal, because graphic reportage will also be, you also have to follow certain journalistic norms, like Fixer, right? You see, like if you like Joe Sacco's Fixer, this is a wonderful book, right? So he's in Bosnia, he's in Sarajevo, there's a editor who has sent him, there is all these resources. So and then, so you have your story, you have your images, then that has to be shaped by somebody who knows the business, and this has to then be produced and given a space in a magazine or an online format or somewhere. And then you have published that one first story, and then you're like, okay, I want to expand this and do another. But then you do another short story for this another editor, and you do another one, right? And then at the end of maybe 2 years, you really understand what it's like to work in the field. So for me, it was yes. So for that, you need the resources to be out there doing the interviews, doing the sketches, all of that. You can't do it in your half an hour office break, lunch break, right? You really need that degree of commitment to do that work. You need an editor who's going to support you with a whole lot of things, including financial. And then after that, possibly you'll need a grant that is going to help you to go and do that. So that is one aspect that I think we sometimes tend to ignore, but is very necessary and very important. For instance, the other thing that I keep asking is that there's so many online magazines in India, looking at Indian politics now, right? But how many of them publish graphic reportage? So where are our young people? So your architect. So where are the young people going to start publishing their short graphic reportage stories, right? So there is that. I mean, I think this is a huge thing in shaping, and then it's going to require 5 years, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of work before you are able to get that where all of it is going to come together, as you mentioned, the stories. So all of it is stuff that you'll have to go and start doing in order to be able to perfect it, right? The interviews, like for instance, so for the NRC pieces, I had to have my entire secondary readings on citizenship. I had to know what this country was thinking, what the legal precedents were, what they were doing in the partition, what is the history of citizenship, what all the changes, what is the new Supreme Court change that has happened, what is the Supreme Court doing right now. So all of this background, you needed a secondary material, and which is going to be true of any work you do before you set about to do those interviews, right? So need all of this secondary, you'll need time and resources to do this. Then the other thing is also going to be a lot of these, like any kind of journalist, the first time you go out in the field and do an interview and try to do the sketches, it's going to be a mess. So there is also, you're going to have to constantly keep getting these assignments, so you are able to figure out you're able to figure out what skill sets specifically you're going to that you may choose to develop, right? So there is the secondary research. You'll need the resources for all of that, right? You'll need to be able to access these papers, all of that. Then you'll need the funds and the security to be able to go through the field and to be able to do all this interview. Then to some extent, you'll need a little bit of training on how to handle the so what would happen? So if you're a journalist in a newspaper, your senior colleagues, everyone sort of. So then that's the other thing. You're going to need a little bit of support on how to, and then and then um, you're going to have to figure out your own tools of the trade for the field. Are you going to work with a phone camera that you take a phone and quickly run in case the police charge and it's the middle of a demonstration and you're trying to do something, right? You're not going to be able to sit around sketching at that point, right? So then you have so you'll need your whole kit of and where to use what. So all of this. I mean, it's terribly exciting, but I haven't been able to get a second graphic reportage commission since then, right? So when people ask me this question, I always, because I think sometimes, I know that there'll be people here who'd be very, very interested in graphic reportage, but I just want them to also not put too much burden on themselves that why am I doing a piece? I've done 3 pieces, but why doesn't it have the strength and the why doesn't it have the power of a geocycle piece? Because there is also a lot of other resources you need. So I don't know whether I've answered your question, but like just around,
Yeah.
sort of working around your, yeah.
Right. I was thinking of it like, because you also spoke not necessarily like, okay, of course, you have the whole economy of publishing, etc. But you've also spoken very often about like, how that notebook is something that accompanies you, and then it's something that you take with you. And then I was wondering if like, the pieces that may get funded or may not get funded later, do they emerge from those quick sort of throwaway interactions with the field, or is it from a conversation that you then later go on to draw out? So just that mediation with the act of drawing
Yeah,
on the
yeah, yeah.
field.
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned, like I sort of mentioned, I think the best, I think in some sense, I think the best tool is to just really, really enjoy doing it. Right. I mean, the sketchbook thing, it's not something, I mean, I know, I mean, I'm sorry, because I also work outside institutions, right? So no one has ever, I've not had the luxury. This is the sheer luxury of actually someone saying, "Ki, go out there and do this drawing, do an assignment." I've never had that. So the thing is, then I think the sketchbook or the iPad or whatever, this constant documenting or sketching, it has to be a thing of love. It's just something you're going to have to enjoy doing. Right. It's like how people enjoy taking selfies, right? Like, yeah, I mean, then like if you're somebody, I mean, to be able to produce this huge selfie art installation, you have to be somebody who really enjoys it. Like you have to really be, it can't be. So I think with the sketchbooks, I mean, invest in them. Right, I have like a million sketchbooks. I mean, don't take the sketchbooks too seriously. And that's the other thing, because also a lot of my work is pre-social media. So the other thing I would say is, yes, so the other thing that will be very interesting is to see how do people who are sketching now, and I don't know this answer, how are people who are sketching now and constantly putting stuff up on Instagram or something, how does that work? Right? Like what does happen? What, like, are you constantly taking, do you put up, is your sketchbook something that's very personal, something that's just something that you do all the time? Or are you doing it to some, is it something that you're doing, uh, um, or is it something that you share with your audience, so the sketchbook itself becomes a part of the work, right? Or because that's the other thing, right? Like, because the social media is such a big part of how we mediate our works now. So I would really suggest that keep a lot of books. Like, just have those books lying around. Put a book into your bag every time. Like, practical advice, every time you're going out somewhere, just put one of those books in. And don't worry too much about doing perfect stuff, right? It's just, you're just doing, it can be doodles, it can be likenesses, it can be, and you'll find, and I think the sketchbook is also about finding your own style. Right? What you want to work on. I mean, what is it about the world that captivates you enough to make that doodle?
Right.
Right? What is it about that? What is it about the world that holds you enough to be able to do that? Right? So yeah, so I think it's a great practice, right? And and having those books, and don't worry too much about where all of that's going to go. I think just having it is good enough. And for fiction, you can always go back, flip through the pages. It's very useful. It's a useful exercise to flip through the pages. Sometimes you may use them, sometimes you may not use them. But for a proper story, I mean, I would just, but for a proper non-fiction commission story, I would say that, you probably have to do everything from like, your sketchbooks. You're lucky if there's something in the sketchbooks, but otherwise you'll have to probably start from like point A, go there, do the interviews, do the sketches, come back, take the photos, come back, look at all the references, see if you could put something together. Yeah, it's a little bit like
Right.
that.
Right. Thanks so much. And, I know that just before this, you mentioned the hotel at the end of the world. And I think it's one of your works that, a lot of us are familiar with as well. And I think
Mhm.
very often for students who have won awards, and this is one of Aditya's questions as well, which I'll get to, like, we give out books, and your book has been one of the books that we give
Oh,
out awards. But, especially because you speak about like graphic reportage, and of course you speak about
mm,
fiction, and this is one of the
yeah.
works that somehow seems to, it's not reportage in that sense, but it does
Yeah.
seem to be, but it is anchored a little bit in myth and in the fable and all of that. And if you think of the graphic novel as, or the comic book is one of frames, and if you're looking at, anyone who's looking at understanding comics, and that is the book also that I'm referencing right now, he looks at Westcott McCloud. He looks
Mm,
at the concept of closure, which is like closing narrative gaps between comic panels, and it's also, it has the effect of encompassing unseen but acknowledged background. Now, I know that that book is obviously not necessarily trying to push or consolidate the idea that these are stories that are coming from, the northeastern states of the country, not the northeast, of course, as a clubbing together, because that's not a term that is
mm,
important or that we work with. But is it important that the reader constructs this unseen or unacknowledged background that is anchored in a
mm,
geography or a specific history, one that that connects it to the
mm, mm,
people that it has, whose stories
mm.
it has come
Yeah,
to
right,
speak?
right, right. So first of all, a confession, I have never read that book. That the
Okay.
one on comics, no, that's Scott. Yeah, I have tried to many times, but somehow something about the style has, it's just like, yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
So what? Yeah. So see, the thing is, one, of course, it's such an early work. No, it's a book I did in my 20s. That was a long time ago. And my 20s were a while ago. So it is a book of my 20, it is a book of your 20s in a sense. And because in some sense, you really have the confidence to go and do whatever you feel like and like, put it into a book. And it's always interesting for me that there's still so much interest in that book. And it's always sort of, it's puzzled me a little bit, but well. Um, so the question is one, what a reader ought to make of a book is never, never, never in the artist's hands, in that sense, right? Particularly, I think, for fiction. So I cannot, much as I would love to, everyone who wrote me a bad review, like I still have my eyes on all those people. But at the end of the day, you know, what people are going to make of your book, or what, how people choose to read your book with or without geography, with or without a backdrop, um, it's something, it's the first thing you have to give up once you put out a book into the world, right? Because there is no way you can control that in any sense, right? And I'm not even sure, and in a sense, I'm not even sure if I would like to, right? So, I mean, so sometimes you hear people write certain reviews or look at your book in a certain way, and you feel a little bit like, oh, but this is not really about that, or so on. But like whether you ought to read it against a particular geography or a particular political background or not is is um, is really immaterial in a sense, right? Because you could, if you wish to, And at the same time, I mean, you're very welcome to read it without, because, we've read all this. Like, I mean, we read all this. I read a lot of Japanese and South American works, including Japanese, including comics. There was a huge Japanese comic. I mean, Japanese, because their comics is so huge. Particular sets of Japanese comics are a huge influence on me, right? But I have no sense. I have absolutely no sense of like their geography or their particular political moment that they're talking about. But there is something about this. But obviously there is also something about, I don't want to use the word universal, but there is something about a story that grips me or that compels me to continue reading, to seek out some kind of individual meaning for me. But having said that, of course, but can you read the NRC pieces without saying having any kind of background? Without taking into account that. I don't know. It's but this is not. But see, this is. But for my own book, I will not have. I will not make any claims of how people ought to or not to do it. Like,
Yeah.
it's really up to them in that sense. Yeah.
I'm going to take Aditya Boite's questions now. He has this whole battery of questions, and he's a fourth year student at C. He says, "Hi, Parismita. I was fortunate enough to be gifted a copy of your book, The Hotel at the End of
Oh,
the World, and I wanted to reach out and share how much I
mm.
loved it. The
Oh,
way the
thank
book
you.
navigates The way the book navigates through a range of emotions is remarkable. The scenes and viewpoints felt so vividly crafted that even without actual photographs, they conveyed a profound narrative, bringing each character's background and struggles to life in such a powerful way. One question I've been eager to ask is about your artistic choice in the illustrations. The raw, unpolished sketches without sharp edges of finished details in the depiction of people, faces, spaces, and sceneries seem to add a deeply experiential layer to the storytelling. Do you find that this sketching style enhances the emotional depth of themes like oppression, hope, and friendship in the narrative? There are a bunch. I'm just going to get through them. You can
Yeah, yeah.
answer them in whatever order.
Okay, let me.
Additionally, I was struck by the rich layered stories within the setting
Mm,
of the northeastern borderlands, an
mm,
area often overlooked in broader Indian literature. How important was it for you to situate your narrative in this landscape? And how did the unique cultural and political context of the region influence your storytelling?
mm,
Another aspect that intrigued me was the recurring motif of storytelling itself, with characters sharing folk tales and legends throughout the book. Did you intentionally weave these oral traditions into the fabric of the narrative to reflect a sense of collective memory? And how do you see the act of storytelling as a way to preserve cultural identity? Finally, the theme of transience, the constant movement of characters and the temporary nature of their interactions, seem to underscore a sense of impermanence and displacement. How do you feel this theme shapes the emotional core of the book, and what does it say about the relationships between the characters? There's a thanks with a
mm.
smiley at the end. Um,
Right, right. Yes, yes.
okay.
Okay. No, no, thank you so much. Thank you so much because thank you for taking the trouble to read the book and for your questions. I mean, it is very, very generous of you to have. Mm. So the thing is that, one is that it is, as I mentioned, it's a book I did a long time ago. And sometimes now, this artistic choice of the illustrations, sometimes now, I have to really struggle to get that hand back. Right. In fact, one of the presentations I was making in Guwahati again through Zoom, and one young person sort of said that not the work you're doing now, but she said, no, no, not the more naturalistic kind of work, documentary work you're doing now. I'm talking about the hotel kind of sketches, and I really got what he meant, right? Because so I got a lot of grief about it as well. These raw, unpolished sketches. Some people were very upset. They were just like, "This is such an awful book, and this is such awful illustrations, and what is happening." So you see, experimental goes both ways, right? So you really liked it, and you felt that it's the sketching style has somehow worked for the story, but lots of people did not feel that way. I had reviewers who were just like, "Oh, but the drawing style is so awful." So that was a but that so that was it's interesting. So it's interesting, and I think that's also what art is about, and what I think this exchange of and this engagement around art is about, that particular style that someone may find quite repulsive, you think it's interesting and is able to do things with it. Yeah. So thank you, so thank you for that. So thank you for so looking at the style and seeing how it could tie to things like oppression and hope and friendship in the narrative, right? And yeah. So the thing is, a lot of my work is located in the Northeast, so that is, it's a, it's large. I mean, I'm surrounded, I'm in this environment, I'm immersed in it, and somehow I've sort of chosen to tell stories located there. Yeah. So, yes, and thank you for the recurring motif of folk tales and legends and all of that. In fact, the new project I'm working on is called Feminist Narratives of Cloth and Vegetables. So again, which again, sort of goes back to this whole question of folk tales and legends of cloth and vegetables, which are women centric, right? So you are absolutely right that it is a recurring motif. It is something that I find a lot of. In fact, I also, in the middle of all this, I also did a series of. I also did this column for Voice of Fashion, where I look at where again I use folklore and these myths and folklore, but to look at but to interrogate different aspects of culture, and I found that an incredibly fun thing. Just all these, we have so many crazy stories, and then to take up these stories and see how they shape in today's world, and to see what they're telling us, because stories get passed down and they get contained in certain moments, but it's always interesting to say that, okay, but but there were so many people, right, who would have told these stories, each tell us. So what we do as writers and as artists is, and especially when you do a book, is that I kind of pin down one particular version of the story. But telling, like the oral, which is how a lot of these stories have moved, there is such a vitality to it. There is so much risk and mobility in those stories. So I find them, and so I find them very, very exciting. Folklore, and not just by itself, but in how in what they could be telling us, in how they help me answer questions that I have about my day-to-day engagement with feminism, or um, how I look at culture, how I engage with stories and so on. So yes. No, so this preserve cultural identity, and no, I don't see storytelling as a way of preserving anyone's cultural identity. Yes, it does do so, but in very specific contexts. Storytelling is very much, and it's all, and then, if you look at the story as weaving, so if weaving if a woven cloth is a story, it is, right? So a woven cloth, because people who know how to weave, they can read the patterns and what it's telling you. So yes, many acts of storytelling are ways of preserving certain cultural identities, I think. But I think specifically, I think if it is an identity, then I'll go back to the wayward line. I would rather this identity is more wayward than a preserved one. Let it, like, no, and that's what I'm saying, challenge it. Like, I did Centrepiece and I wrote an introduction, and I was like, tear it out, it's okay. I've written things and I want someone to come in and say, no, all of this is, passe now, it's gone. We have another interpretation. We will do things differently. So preserving things in a certain form, that does not interest me in a sense. Yeah. And the question of transience, yes. In hotel, everyone is traveling. Even in other books, people are constantly moving and traveling. So I enjoyed, yes. Yes, all of that. Yeah, so I mean, basically, I agree with that. It's an interpretation. It's very generous. So thank you. Thank you so much, Aditya. Yes. So thank you so
Aditya,
much,
yeah.
Aditya, for taking the time and to put down the questions and for reading the books.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you. You,
Aditya.
you can look at Pieces Come as well. It could be interesting. I'd like to see what you'd have to say about that. Yeah.
Okay, so say you're working constantly between writing and drawing, and very often, like obviously in all of the works, there is this play between them, and it's interesting in the NRC works as well, because over there you have almost the image being constructed is this collage of documentation and those newspaper reports where text takes on this sort of meaning and value of the image itself, and all these definitions start getting blurred, and this whole question of definitions actually becomes really interesting. And there's this excerpt from an interview by Donna Haraway, and she's a scholar. She's known for
yeah. I like
yes.
Donna Haraway. Yeah.
So she's working across, for anyone who doesn't know, she's working across various disciplines and fields, from feminist studies to history of consciousness studies. And in this interview, she's responding to a question on figuration, because her work in that question is about refiguring what constitutes or what counts as nature. But the answer here goes into some other territory as well, I feel. And it's a very poetic answer. And she says, I love words that just won't sit still. Once you think you've defined them, it turns out that they are like ship hulls full of barnacles. You scrape them off, but the lava resettle and spring up again. Figuring is a way of thinking or cogitating or meditating or hanging out with ideas. I'm interested in how figures help us avoid the deadly fantasy of the literal. Of course, the literal is just another trope, but we're going to hold the literal still for a minute as the trope of no trope. Figures help us avoid the fantasy of the one true meaning. They are simultaneously visual and narrative as well as mathematical. They are very sensual. And I feel like the excerpt is, constantly throwing up these metaphors of how stories settle and shift, and also blurring the distinction between writing and drawing by using this very happy chance word, figuring, that conjures up, both ideas of wrestling with ideas, words, and it's invoking the suggestion of the drawn as well. And mostly because she uses the phrase like, the deadly fantasy of the literal, which is a task that, drawing takes on very successfully. So I was just wondering, how do you make for yourself that thinking, writing, drawing as this kind of world building exercise, which takes it, out of the literal? Like, how do you decide where to rely on what are the distinctions that you make between forms?
Yeah. That's very that's a very interesting question, because this oh my God, I always forget these names just when this the person who oh my God, what is his name? The person who wrote I swear I saw this, the things on drawing.
Michael Taussig.
Yes. So Taussig has this really, it has this beautiful formulation. I don't agree with everything in that book because, because already they work so strongly with the primacy of the word in that sense. But there is this beautiful thing where he talks about like the terror of writing, how he, how he would go towards his drawing, the notebooks. He would go towards the drawing, figure of the drawing as a terror from, because of his terror of writing, of writing the again talking about like just what how that anthropological moment, right, that moment that that is just impossible to capture in that sense, and he sees drawing as a way of engaging with that, right? And I think but to step back from what he's saying, I think what see I think it's a very difficult thing to really formulate and think around this constant as I do, this constant engaging with all these different forms, because I think that if I'd been fortunate enough to spend my whole life, like, I don't know, drawing one rock or one hill, I think it would have been a life well spent, so I don't feel that if you just working solely with prose or working solely with things, that makes your process any less rich or significant in that sense. And sometimes I do feel that and there is a price to pay, there's a price to pay of like sort of in being very multidisciplinary, and in constantly sort of moving between forms and mediums, right? Because I think after Hotel Film worked much better if I'd written another graphic novel, because I had readers, I had this whole thing, and then I had to go and write a book, right? So one is that I enjoy the disruption, perhaps. I enjoy the disruption. I enjoy being able to being able to work with prose and submit to the discipline that it requires of me. And I also now I'm beginning to work with slightly large. I'm beginning to work, experiment a little bit with textiles, and I'm beginning to work with slightly larger drawings. And I like the disruption, and I like what it's doing, because I'm able to, now that I feel like I like the difficulty and my own inexpertness of working with textile, the challenges it does to me, like the way it sort of compels me to keep working and the alienness of it. So I like this disruption. It's not a terribly convenient thing for your career. Yeah, but it is what it is. I think we are shaped as much by our political process. And the other thing is also, I also, now I've also started to say that my career, a lot of my choices are also being determined by the kind of politics and the history that I have personally lived through in the last whatever 20 odd years, because because the works that I've done have also to some extent also reflect on the kind of work that was allowed, permitted, encouraged in those in that particular time. And so there is also, and I never, and I always want to foreground the fact that for those of us who work without regular art grants, who work in situations like this where where writing and drawing can be somewhat perilous, in precarious.
Yeah.
That it is also inevitable that our journey will be shaped by political exigencies, by political choices, by political moments, that determine what we are going to be able to continue and what we can't, and you know, and how we decide to make our way while continuing to produce work. If the point is that we continue to produce work. Um, in correspond to whatever whatever our circumstances at the moment are. So it's a little, I've sort of
I
gone a
think that
little
is
off
what you.
track, but
No, I
yeah.
think that's exactly what you kind of answered when you set up the, task of the talk also, as, talking about a drawing
Yeah.
as a practice shaped by political exigencies, and not just of the field itself, but of your
Mm,
own self as well.
mm,
Um, yeah, and I just, my other question was, if the drawings of the graphic novel are, if they're about a certain catching up with reality or reporting on reality, like I feel that the ways in which they happen, they necessitate, they almost demand that you open
mm,
up reality to include the presence of myths and fables,
mm,
etc., into
mm,
this seemingly distinct everyday reality, because you also witness how these mediate a reality for those whom you encounter. And when it comes to graphic reportage, the drawing is always assumed to be subservient to this camera, which gives you some form of a mechanical objectivity of the photograph, as they say it. But the drawing is, it immediately does away with this idea, or like, this conceit of detached journalistic objectivity, also in how it's recording, in what it's doing. And it's, problematizing that whole concept of, like, reality based representations. And your work is anything other than detached. You're looking at seeing people beyond
mm,
these definitions made by institutions, governmental, touristic, colonial, all those interconnected species. So, if graphic reportage and drawing for it are becoming, both art and information, biography and history, and in the case of the writer, they're becoming something else as well. Uh, do you feel that tension in the work, and do you need, is that something that
yeah, yeah,
a tension that you
yeah,
need to
yeah.
resolve in the work
Yeah.
yourself?
I think that's, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the central question of why we keep doing what we do is
Yeah.
is is because of this tension, right? Is because I think we are all constantly trying to answer those questions that we set out to, and each time, and maybe failure is a necessary part of the process, okay, that which is also like, we are constantly trying to interpret and answer these questions, constantly doing so. And then, and some of us restless ones, you're sort of moving forms. And sometimes I think that, maybe the questions we're asking are, sometimes it's when you read many books by an author, or they're whole collection, and then you sort of look at and then sometimes you get the feeling that, they're asking the same question. They may be very different books, but, their concerns, their questions um, are often um, are often reflected from book to book in that sense, right? So I think, with nonfiction, with fiction, it's an interesting space to think that what are the questions that continue to accompany us? What are the questions that are no longer relevant? What are the new concerns? And I should also hope that even stylistically, because you're also asking about, because your question is also about the question of style, right? Like, how do you, how, the drawing style, just the act of drawing, which gives you that, which dismantles some of the photographers aren't going to aren't going to like this, because even with photographs, I mean, there's so much experimental work going on, and they're trying to dismantle some of these I mean, I mean, you have such good photographers, and they're working so, and they're working to challenge so many of what we see as a conventional photographic essay in that sense, right? So I'm also a little bit like cautious about making claims in some sense that drawing is able to do that, like compared to other arts, because I think, because everyone is working within that medium and able to do that. But personally, yes, I have been able to see that drawing is able to at least serve as a disruptive force to whatever
Yeah.
sense of expectations we have from an image, from an essay, from a news piece. So if anything, at least that you have. And then, of course, but there isn't that much. I mean, but would have imagined that in a media space like ours, at least with all these independent things, there would be more graphic reportage. But I don't see that much happening. So which is a real pity.
I think there is some experiment that the fifth year students with their thesis research, they're constantly trying to make it a form of their arguments. But yeah, we'll see. I just want to. Does anyone from the audience have any questions? We could take those right now.
But college is a great time for experimentation, to be able to do all these nonfiction and fiction and whatever. Like, I mean, this is the best time when you have the space to be able to do so much experimenting.
Okay, yeah, sorry, 1 second. Rupali has a question. Joel, could you let Rupali into the call?
Yes. Answer. Rupali, try to open your camera.
Yeah.
Hi, Parismita. So lovely to see you again, and so lovely to hear you. And I mean, it's kind of something that I was sort of thinking about, constantly when you were talking about the struggles of spaces of, being outside the institution and, of publishing houses and other things. And I'm just wondering, because there's so much, like you talk about this idea of, your work was started with being fiction, and then it went to non-fiction, but, and then you speak about the disruptive, but also there's so much blurring between the two, right? Like fiction and non-fiction, because like from the first work, it seems like there's this whole idea of speaking of a geography that we don't hear about and, speak about, and there's a whole sort of bringing in a certain way of seeing a place from, right? And then in the non-fiction work that you're talking about, there's all kinds of ways in which fiction comes in to protect identities, but also this idea of a projective dimension that fiction has. So there's so many things that fiction does, where non-fiction then also kind of blurs that edge between, fiction and non-fiction. So I'm just thinking it's what would be useful, because I think some of these categories that we've also generated come from publishing houses, right? Like from mainstream publishing houses that we say fiction, non-fiction. but there's so much space to experiment. And I see that in your work as well, right? Like there's this whole sort of pushing the boundaries. We call it disruptive, and of course, like the disruptive nature of art is what allows you to bring in new ways of world making, right? To kind of imagine new ways of living. So I'm just wondering if you see any experimental spaces of publishing or the things. I know you said they aren't, but perhaps those are the spaces that we really need to kind of suss out and kind of work with, and really, because otherwise, like some of these silos that we've created for ourselves are so they put so much expectation of what we should be writing in fiction, or what journalism should be producing, that somehow we kind of this world making and imaginations of new worlds somehow doesn't happen. Either it's like this kind of flight of fantasy on the one hand, or then this very kind of grounded reportage where you're sort of producing certain facts, but facts are not really kind of facts, right? There's always slippages in them. There's kind of worlds of dream, the dreams in them as well. So I'm just wondering if you could really sort of speak to some of that disruption.
Yeah, so I'm all for alternative spaces. I mean, and I think, and I congratulate you and the team that's even made this possible, in some sense, right? And obviously, I see that, the SEA, I see that you, and which is why universities are so precious, universities, because this is when you have so much, the weight of the world is not on you yet, you're not, and you have so much space to, which is, in fact, when I'm speaking to, college students or something, I always say, start that Zine, start that magazine, do that project, write, I mean, make that magazine, do all of it, because this is such an excellent time to be, to create these experimental spaces yourself. Right, which is what I think we are all also doing to some extent. No, actually, my specific thing about journalistic nonfiction, that kind of, when you're reporting, like, because I think because Apurva mentioned Joe Sacco, and Joe Sacco is such a hard thing to live up to, in a sense, that kind of very intense reporting at the visual as well as text level. What I wanted to just highlight there was that does require a certain amount of committed resource across certain amount of time, because I'm always, Rupali, getting this question of why aren't there more graphic novels in India? Because because for a long time I saw myself primarily as a graphic novelist. Just all the years, we did the Pao Collective, all of that. I mean, these were all attempts to find these little spaces, right? And the thing is that we have to, and you are right, we have to find our own role, our own way of telling our own stories. In that sense, with what resources we have, what other choice do we have? We have to create our spaces. So that is, so I just want to highlight that particular fact about a particular kind of graphic narrative, because, we all have access to these books, and we all have this question, why am I not able to do this? Why am I not able to do this perfect piece of, this, because they're lovely, it's all this, you're able to spend so many months there to get the story, spend more months working on it, all of that. I mean, he's very good also, but all of this so yes, I think we have a lot of stories, and it is now, it is yeah, and and then we have to just keep creating these spaces, how where we are. So yeah, so thank you for that. But you're absolutely right that we have no choice but to do that, seek out these spaces.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. I think Prasad Khanolkar has a question. I'm going to leave.
Right.
Thanks, Rupali. Could Prasad Khanolkar, yeah, he's there.
Hi.
I'm just going to get my phone. 1 second.
Sure.
Okay, I just have my phone there. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yes.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. I mean, I had a question which is probably related to what Rupali was asking also. Now, I was wondering if you see waywardness not just as something that is post facto, sort of a line that you're drawing, but as a method that seems very pertinent to the region, but also, I mean, in generally in life, and I'm also thinking of, Dolly Ticon's work here, where there's a certain uncertainty and unpredictability to life within which things start emerging that one cannot necessarily predict, but sort of make sense of, and then you have to sort of put them together. And I think that seems to be, and also because, this is a session that has been followed by a series of other talks where the question of process has been integrated, but there always seems to be this jump. It's almost like, one doesn't know when the artist takes the jump to the drawing. There's this sort of unknown, this sense of unknownness, which, is always present. And I was thinking if it's part of the process of, and what is that process then of, like there's a bun, then you sort of draw, and then you have to put it together. So it's something that is itself a method of how, work comes together in some sense.
Yeah, yes. Right. Thank you so much for that. Because I think, yes, actually, I'm seeing that. I'm seeing my work very much as that now, as wayward, as method, and because it is also because now, because I mean, at this point, I'm also now reflecting. I'm also forced to reflect back a little because this hotel at the end of the world is not leaving me, right? So each time a question about that book comes, it is basically, I have to do this whole journey back and draw out and I think the idea of the wayward line, it's something that I've begun to think about very recently. I sort of just came about, as I was preparing for this talk, in fact, right? Because we don't spend that much time thinking about our own process. I don't, right? Like I think about my process only when I'm asked to do it. Right. Otherwise, you're sort of going from project to project. You're doing things. You're getting on with life. All of that. And in fact, for a long time, I used to be, I can't pick up a book that has come out of the press. Like sometimes I can't look at a book for the next 2-3 years. In saal ke baad, I may just be able to pick it up. So it's also not been like so too wrong. But of course, I do it as a part of this. But this idea of the wayward line as method, I think there's a lot of potential to that, and that's something I really want to think about. So thank you so much for your observations in that sense about that jump, right? That jump that's a beautiful formulation. That that jump when it comes to drawing, there is that the unknown, the inexplicable, that so, and wayward as and also the wayward wayward as politics, wayward as a political moment is just, I think there's a lot of scope of sort of like looking at our lives and our arts.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Rita.
Thank you.
Thanks, Prasad. Are there any more questions at the moment? I just had one quick question about, you've spoken about the collective practice as well, and I've heard another of your interviews where you were talking about, telling the story through a variety of means and really producing, forging an identity in a sense. And it comes I was just thinking of the idea of the collective artistic practices, connected to the idea of a cultural democracy where, practices, and artistic expressions are generated by individuals and communities rather than institutionally sort of organized. But in the workings of the collective, I'm just wondering how does research sort of coincide, or what are the conflicts of narratives and how do you resolve those?
Yeah. So, thank you. So that two part. I mean, this question can be answered in two parts, right? So one is that is the collective work of something like Centrepiece, where I was the editor, so I was able to invite, like you are able to do, with your. I was able to curate a whole. I was able to invite women artists and poets and writers and photographers across a particular geography and beyond that, and ask them to and then and commission work, And in that commissioning, and in that commissioning, in that follow-up, in the waiting for the works to come, all the conversations that happen in the book, outside the book, around the book, all of that. So for me, that was a very, very rich collective experience, right? Because I do enjoy. I also enjoy editing. I enjoy editorial work to some extent, because I feel that with all I enjoy being able to find a seat in someone else's work and idea, someone else's work and someone else's life, and see if they're able to come up and see if they're able to do something completely different from like the work that they usually do. So I find that extremely exciting, just as exciting as I find like my own work. And so I love that. So I love this collective work. I love being able to see ideas in other people and see those explode and disrupt and some disrupt their own practice sometimes. So that, yeah, so and then that collective, just being able to work with a group of people, because so much of my work is very, very so, because I'm working on a novel now. I don't know when it will be finished, if ever. And then what is that? That is just sitting hours and hours and hours of work, sitting on my own and writing, right? So from there, and that is what also a lot of us who were in that project felt a little bit like, that we were in these little corners, with all of these problems and trying to find work. So that was a very rich. So that kind of collective work among your collective of journalists and writers and poets. The other form of collective work that I've been doing of late, which has also been just wonderful in that sense, and I wish I could do more of it, was doing workshops with non-professionals, right? Doing word drawing and story writing workshops with people who have not necessarily followed this particular educational trajectory. So or a very conventional sort of, which also goes back to Rupali's wonderful sort of, intervention when she speaks about, we have to make these spaces. So that is my own sort of very, very limited way of creating these little islands of people working together. So I've been doing these workshops with, like, say, weavers and carpenters and, people people in the rural areas. And that's been a very, very rich experience, because, and for me, it's really like disrupted so much of what I think is art, so much of what I, consciously or unconsciously sort of privilege in writing, in that. So I've learned a lot from that, working with college students, people who do not professionally work. And one of the things I've been able to see is how people naturally do group work. So one group of people who actually, who I'm sort of in connection, who I sort of know in connection with an education project. So this group of people with whom I did sustained workshops for about 2 years, like, it was really odd. They wouldn't be able to finish the works that they began. They wouldn't be able to finish it at home, because it was such a collective thing, this drawing and writing. It was just that workshop space, and it will be like, it was just incredible. Like, 3 people will be illustrating one drawing. Right. And that for me was just, and I've not seen anything. And, I had not imagined that this kind of thing was possible consistently. Right. So for me, the collective is very rich. It's like my alter ego. Like, I have this one part of me which has to do all of this work on my own, and then this other person who really thrives in the collective. So thank you for that wonderful question.
Thanks. Okay, I think we could, it's been an hour and 45 minutes, and I think we could close the talk. And I just have like a little, I mean, in my limited reading, I always end up falling back on John Berger to, conceptualize anything around drawing. And there's this book of his called Bento's Sketchbook. And he says that, we who draw do so not only to make something observed visible to others, but also to accompany something invisible to its incalculable destination. And I know we've been trying to not pin down the drawing, but it does really, that's what the drawing sets out to do very often. And he's also in the same book, he's talking about the story, and he uses the word, because again, like, the ways in which words get used. Tosic does it with the word drawing. We've been trying to do it right now with the whole figuration. And he's talking about, the word outcome, where, it traditionally refers to how a story ends, whether it has a happy outcome or a sad outcome. But it can also refer to how, in following a story, where it sort of leaves you when you follow the storyteller. And because you're following the storyteller's attention and what it notices, what it ignores, what it lingers on. And you sort of become accustomed to the storyteller's ways of bestowing attention and then, making a certain sense of things. And you acquire their storytelling habits, actually. And if the story impresses you, then he says that is what remains with you, and that is what becomes your own, and that is what becomes a part of your ongoing life, and that is the inheritance of the story, or the outcome of the story. And I feel like that's what the task of an author is. Sort of giving form to and bequeathing their own inheritances, especially in drawing, writing, whatever forms those might take. So thank you, Parismita, for sharing your forms with us.
Yes.
It's been lovely to have you. And we typically have a customary break of 2 weeks between talks, but our next talk is on the 4th of October, which is next Friday, and it's with Jasmine, Nilani, Joseph. So join us at that time. Thanks so much, Parismita.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Right.
Bye.
Right. Bye.
Bye.